Welcome back to another Boxscore Geeks show. I am your host, Andres Alvarez, aka Nerd Numbers, and you can find me on Twitter as Nerd Numbers. We have a very special guest with us tonight, Jonathan Weiler, and you can find, I'm going to actually let you say it so I don't mess up your Twitter handle. Jonathan, what's your Twitter handle? And just say hey so they know your voice for the audio only.
Hey Dre, my Twitter handle is at John Weiler, JONWEILER, and that's where you can
And
find
say
me.
that one more time. I actually have the show playing on in the background behind you, so that you can tell the lag between live and us.
Got it. So it's at John Weiler, JONWEILER.
Awesome. The show, as always, is produced by our amazing host, Brian Foster, who you can find on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Give a quick shout out, Brian.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited to have Professor Weiler back on the show. It's been about a year and 10 days actually, since you're last on the show during March Madness before. We talked about the NCAA then, and we're going to do it today. And yeah, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts about what's happened in the past year and what's going to happen in the future.
It's been a very eventful year, actually, for the NCAA.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And okay, so apologies for being late for those of you who've gotten used to us starting live every week at 6:30. We're not changing the showtime. That's all on me. I'm out in sunny California. Brian and myself saw WrestleMania this last weekend. So that's why I was running late. Those of you who live in California know about the traffic. And we may actually talk a little bit about wrestling and with a great topic you brought up, Jonathan, which I'm looking forward to. As you may know, we have a poll every week. We'll have to figure out which this week's is while we're talking. Last week, we actually asked if you thought that the 76ers might actually turn into a playoff team next year. You guys quite aren't on board, but you almost got up to 50-50. I'm assuming thanks to the play of Nerlens Noel. As a good segue into the show, Nerlens Noel, of course, was a top prospect, and we are going to be talking about top NCAA prospects, a topic near and dear to your heart, Jonathan. But before we get there, for those of you who don't know, Jonathan Weiler, you are a professor at UNC, the real one, North Carolina, not the fake one. My wife went to Northern Colorado, not, and I'm sure there's lots of Northern California as well. Which gives you a really unique insight into all of this. You've written a lot of academic papers on this. You're a political scientist and have a lot on there, and have one of the best blogs on the net. I think we mention you once a week. You didn't give us the out. We said we were going to give you a lifetime achievement shout out, and you said no. You wanted the weekly. You went for the annuities on the lottery ticket, not the lump sum.
You all are far too kind to me, so I have to thank you for that.
No, I think you and Kevin Draper are two of our favorite writers. The ESPN Watch, I'll try and say that 3 or 4 more times. If you're not following that blog and are listening to our show, what's wrong with you? Go read the ESPN Watch. I'll be honest, this show's about an hour long. That's just going to constrain how much we talk about your blog pieces. You've written so many. I literally could probably just pull up my RSS feed and go through old pieces and spend 5 minutes on everything we haven't talked about in the last year. Well, and I was actually curious about that. I know we've had you on the show before. I know I've talked to you before. But what got you to start up that blog?
So a few years ago, I actually had a blog called Sports Media Review. And as the name suggests, I was interested in sports media and how sports media talk about not just sports, but sort of the bigger issues that sports always touches on, whether it's race or gender or markets. And so I dropped that for a few years for a variety of reasons, but was interested in getting back to that. And of course, ESPN is, as Dan Patrick calls it, the mothership. And so since it is the Death Star of sports media, I wanted to focus my attention on that. And so I just, as I said, I've blogged a lot about politics, but frankly, Dre, I find that writing about politics, and I'm including my own writing, it's so partisan and hackneyed that even my own stuff kind of bugs me. And sports, I find, is an opportunity to talk about these bigger social issues, I don't know, a way that's actually more interesting and less partisan. And allows us to have, in some ways, deeper conversations about this stuff than what you find on many political blogs. So those are some of the reasons I started to back up.
I will say one of the interesting things I've noticed about sports, even if things remain partisan, is it draws people together. And that's the hard part, right? I've got my Republican, for those of you that watch the show, it shouldn't really be that surprising which way I lean. But I've got some like Republican relatives that, I see for family events, but I'm not going to interact with them that much on Facebook. In fact, I've kind of stopped because it turns into shouting matches very quickly. Yeah. Whereas sports, I'll sit down with, have a beer or something and talk about Melo with someone. And we might briefly touch on the socioeconomic impacts of, Melo at Syracuse and still be able to leave and be friends and come back and talk again. Whereas if I start saying, how dare you not vote for Obamacare? And my relatives say, why do you want this country to turn into a socialist state where all the babies are wearing Hitler mustaches? That falls apart quickly.
Well, and Dre, on that score, I mean, I actually think that conversation that you have first about Melo or sports or whatever actually paves the way to have a better conversation about politics if you do talk about politics, because you've established some trust and communication, and at least that the other person is human and likable and relatable in some way before you get to the politics discussion. So, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And then one of the other interesting parts about you is, UNC, for people that watch, I think, What Schooled the Price of Admission is a popular one. There have been lots of stories, lots of things, the paper classes.
Yeah.
I'm curious, clearly you're not going to get in trouble for talking about UNC, but I'm really curious about you as a professor there, that impact of talking about them and them being basically a flagship for a lot of the issues that come up on your blog about corruption and athletes and such in, college sports.
Well, yeah, right. I mean, Chapel Hill, you guys know this, of course, has really become ground zero for academic corruption because of the scandal we've had here that's unfolded over the last 4 years. And, I've been really, I'm a UNC fan. I've had season tickets to their basketball games for 13 years now. And UNC is the first team that I've actually adopted as an emotional rooting interest in my adult life. I mean, I have my childhood affinities, which have remained, but UNC is the one team that I didn't root for until, 15 years ago that I really care about now. And it's been very distressing to be here as all this has unfolded. And in part, it is a story about UNC and academic corruption and cutting corners and trying to pretend that this big-time college sports enterprise is something it isn't. And on the other hand, of course, UNC is just one of many examples that one could cite to show, to illustrate the larger problem. So I'm really torn between some of the UNC bashing that goes on the one hand, and on the other hand, a real head in the sand approach that many people in Chapel Hill have had to try to say it's not that big a deal, we're being unfairly picked on, and so forth and so on.
Well, I've watched the ESPN 30 for 30s, I find are great, inadvertently, where you watch, they're talking about a great college story or a college athlete, like I think, is it Brian and the Boz, I think is one, which was really interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm getting the title right, but it was talking about Bosworth and his college thing, and he got in trouble there, and academic eligibility and steroids and all that jazz. But you get these weird behind the scenes views where people don't realize when they're talking about the college world just kind of how weird it sounds. Like, especially if you're outside looking in, where let's get into our first topic as a result, which you brought up. I found it amusing. So in the email back and forth getting on the show, you were like, we could talk pay-for-play athletes unless you think it's drawn out. And I compared it to Kobe. I'm like, this may be a subject that's in the news a lot, but clearly the fans ain't sick of it. We can talk about this. I know Patrick would be willing to, right after this show wraps, right when we're done with you, he would be willing to take you for another 2 hours to keep talking about it. 'Cause it's so prevalent in our emails back and forth. So actually, just as a nice start to that, you sent this out to me. You actually joined. Did you join or help form?
I joined.
Okay.
joined. Yeah.
So you joined an advocacy group for paying college athletes. We'll make sure to include the link. I'm going to try and open it. Sorry for the clicking you're going to hear in the background. But it's the CARE FC statement, and it's College Athletic Rights and Empowerment's Faculty Coalition. And so, like, obviously this has been something you've talked a lot about. I know Dave signed some petition about some legal case about the same thing, but
Yeah.
talk about that and just the whole the realm from your perspective of paying college athletes.
Yeah, so the co-founders of that organization, CARE FC, which just was announced about 2 weeks ago, are Richard Southall and Ellen Starowski. They're both sports administration professors. And actually, Richard and I co-wrote a paper together last year, an academic paper, comparing college athletes today to company town employees from the 19th and 20th century. So my co-author Richard is one of the founders and Ellen Starowski is the other. And I know that they were especially concerned. Obviously, they're concerned about the whole issue of paying athletes. They believe in particular that college football and men's college basketball players are an exploited class of workers who have been subject to this radical restraint on their compensation. And I know that they're especially concerned in the aftermath, and Dre, I know we can get into this, of the ruling in the Northwestern case last year, in which the National Labor Relations Board or regional office has said preliminarily that Northwestern football players are employees. That ruling is now being appealed. But in the aftermath of that, both the state of Michigan and the state of Ohio passed laws saying college athletes cannot form unions. And so
Really?
one of the purposes of CARE FC is to try to educate the public to stem what they fear will be a growing tide of state legislatures, especially in Republican-dominated states, who are sort of anti-union in general and then have additional baggage about college athletics, to stop states from passing more of these laws like the ones they passed in Michigan and Ohio. So that's one of the big impetuses for starting this organization.
So by the way, I'm going to see if I can get all of this in, because I may spoil some of the topics we were going to talk earlier.
Yeah.
But what is fascinating to me about this is, first off, if we look at the NCAA and college athletics in general, it's been a really weird, twisty road as to where they got here. The reason for college athletics, right, was originally to keep the working class out of professional athletics. They basically wanted to say, we don't want poor people playing sports. How do we keep them out? Well, if we tie them to education, poor people aren't going to get education. So we get it. That flipped to you bring poor people into the colleges, but then you can't pay them and all that jazz. What's fascinating about what you're saying is these big college states, if for some odd reason down the line, college sports stays a thing, and I mean, it may be just culturally too built into our country to be completely divorced ever.
Yeah.
They may actually, these big states, because you said Michigan and Ohio, right?
Yes.
Those are two big college athletic states. They may shoot themselves in the foot down the line, because if athletes, if the students start being allowed to get paid, or athletes, I don't want to say students, athletes start getting allowed to get paid, and you have these states where it says you're not allowed to be in a union, they're going to go to the states where it's more favorable to them. And we could see these powerhouses disappear.
Yeah, so Dre, it's very interesting. I mean, you're actually raising a crucial point. So the Northwestern ruling right now only applies to private universities. Okay, so like Duke, Northwestern, Notre Dame, University of Southern California, Wake Forest, Vanderbilt, schools like that. Okay, so because employment law otherwise is essentially governed in this area by state laws. So those private schools I just mentioned, depending on where this litigation goes, could end up having a huge, as you say, competitive advantage over places like Michigan and Ohio, which passed this specific legislation, or states like Alabama. All the southern states, including North Carolina, have laws that prevent public employees from forming unions. And if you're Alabama, you're really into that until it starts to affect your football team. You might want to change that really fast. So it's a
That
very interesting dynamic.
that what's actually fascinating, because we talked a little earlier about, you were saying, sports versus just politics on its own. Like
Yeah.
that's one of the things that ESPN 30 for 30s has been to me watching, because like I went to CSU. Dave went to CSU right before me, basically right as he left. I came in. Got to keep a quant in CSU, I guess. There's probably some smart one in there now, but basically we have the game against CU every year, and it's kind of a big deal. But when I was watching these things about like Texas and southern states, how big of a deal college athletics, like the fact that apparently the days that people declare where they're going to college from like Texas high schools is a big deal. That was so weird for me to watch, to be like, I did not realize how big this industry was. And of course, part of the argument against these people that are like, yeah, they're amateurs. It's not a big deal.
Right. And I know it's true. I mean, football in the South, college football in the South it's its own incredibly powerful cultural phenomenon. And it's existed in this bubble of quote unquote amateurism for a century now. And I think once that bubble is burst, they're going to care much more about being competitive than they are about maintaining amateurism. So that'll be interesting to see what happens.
And I forget the specific one. I keep bringing up ESPN 30 for 30, and Brian and I have talked this before. There was one where the NCAA regulations came down on a school because they've like broken NCAA sanctions like 2 or 3 times for cheating. And they lost their scholarships or whatever, or weren't allowed to compete in a tournament. And people were describing it in this documentary. They were saying our school was crucified. And I went, you aren't allowed to compete in college football, and to you, that is the equivalent of being crucified. And to me, it was like, you're watching the documentary. It's like you could be watching this as if it was an onion piece side by side, and they would be just as ludicrous. But as you said, it's a bubble.
Well, I mean, to tie that back to UNC for a minute, UNC is currently under an NCAA investigation related to this academic fraud that's been uncovered here. And there is great fear that the 2005 national championship banner, Roy Williams' first national championship, will be taken down. Because look,
and by the way, sorry to cut in. Let's prove Darren Rovell wrong. Who are the players that mattered for that banner? He claims you're not going to know any of the players that are playing for these teams that win banners.
Right. So good. So let's see. Sean May, I'm just going to name the first round picks on that team. Sean May, Rashad McCants, Raymond Felton, Marvin Williams, and I'm forgetting. There's another one, and I'm just
Marvin Williams too, Sam Bowie level player, like where it's just it's not his fault. He was drafted in front of 2 other players. All right, so sorry.
So yeah, so there is great fear that if the NCAA decides that because of this academic fraud, some of those players should be deemed ineligible, the 2005 national championship could be in jeopardy. On the one hand, I think most people agree that this whole thing about retroactively revoking Final Fours and wins and et cetera is kind of weird and doesn't make sense. At the same time, symbolically, I think that would be very painful around here. And I think, to use the word you just used a minute ago, Dre, I think a lot of people would feel like UNC is being crucified if we've actually got to take down a sacred national championship banner.
Well, it's kind of weird to me, because if you look at that kind of as a whole, right?
Yeah.
That action doesn't hurt the NCAA, right? The Final Four is going to happen this year, next year, at least for the next decade. The billions of dollars that ESPN and whoever else are going to keep flowing in. It's not going to hurt the coaches, because, like, you have a great one. I'm glad I get to push this one in quick. On the ESPN Watch, it's called "A New Idea for NCAA Reform: Ban Elite Coaches from Using the Word Accountability." And what you basically bring up is the idea that, was it Calipari? Yeah, Calipari at UMass, he's going to get his jersey retired because of what he did there, even though the banner was, like you were saying, the banner was stripped.
Yes.
So it doesn't hurt the coach because the coach is going to get another coaching job somewhere and still even be honored. It's not going to hurt the players who went on to get drafted in the NBA. All it really seems to hurt is the school, and the school, it's hard to try and show empathy, but the school is in this weird like deal with the devil where, as you're saying, it's part of your culture, it's part of people around there like the sport, and then there's this big monolithic business that moved in and is like, there's so much money here, you want to be part of it, but doing so requires signing pacts that are, in some cases heinous.
Yeah, I mean, that particular case, so this UMass just decided recently to retire a jersey in John Calipari's number in honor of his taking UMass to the Final Four in 1996. And of course, that Final Four is officially vacated by the NCAA because Marcus Camby, the star player on that team, received improper benefits. And UMass is essentially acting as if the NCAA penalties never happened. And in some senses, they're right to, because that run in 1996, it did happen. It probably boosted applications to the university for the next 2 or 3 years, as these things often do. And so what do they care that officially there's an asterisk if you open up, a Wikipedia page about Final Fours and you see UMass has an asterisk next to his name? Who cares? So
candidly, I really wish that we just you talked Michigan even as just a state, but I really wish with Chris Webber and the Fab Five, the fact that the school basically has erased Chris Webber from their history officially, I just can't side with that school. And the fact that Chris Webber even politely on Twitter says things. I mean, he's got a career, so I guess he realizes the diplomacy. But to me, it's like that school was nothing without the Fab Five. That school was nothing. They made that. They turned things around so much. And to me, fine, the NCAA strikes him down, but the fact that they just want to kind of turn their backs on Chris Webber is, to me, absurd.
Well, so I'm a Michigan alum, and I graduated in 1987, so that was before the Fab Five got there. But I have never rooted harder for a group of players in my life than the Fab Five. And the fact that all their wins for the 2 years Webber were basically vacated. I mean, it all seems very silly and kind of trivial in a way.
Yeah, and I mean, so just kind of back to everything in general. I'm trying to see if we can kind of get back to baseball. I think what most people miss, because we've talked a lot kind of about around it, and you write a lot about this, is I don't think people get that it's not the fact that athletes aren't paid, it's that they're not allowed to be paid. And one of the things that we're kind of going nuts, we brought up Darren Rovell's name like twice already. I'm dropping his name, but you sent me an article by him, which I tweeted, I sent it to Dave and was like, this reads like it was written by a 5-year-old in terms of logic. The grammar was quite nice, but the logic was 5-year-oldish. But the athletes aren't allowed to be paid, and people act as if there isn't a market for them to be paid. And that, to me, is so bizarre.
Yeah, and so, I mean, just going back to, on this point, Dre, just going back to that UMass team for a second. So they had one great player, Marcus Camby, who went on to be a great NBA player, but they didn't make the final. I think Patrick made this point when we were emailing earlier this evening. If Marcus Camby were teamed up with you, me, Patrick, and Brian, they're not going to the Final Four. And if they're not going to the Final Four, the school isn't getting all the financial and other benefits that a school gets from doing so. So even if I can't name any of the other teammates that Camby had when he made the Final Four in 1996, they obviously had value. And so this idea that Rovell brought up, which he took a lot of heat for, that players shouldn't be paid because you can't name more than a handful of guys playing in the NCAA tournament. I mean, I made the point that most people who tune in to watch the Super Bowl are not serious football fans. They're just there because everybody else is watching the Super Bowl. They probably couldn't name more than 5 players on the New England Patriots. Does that mean that the other 48 guys on the roster should get paid 0 cents? I mean, the logic is just absurd.
Well, my snarky comment is I was like, I'm willing to bet that you take a Final Four from 5 years ago and
Yeah.
ask a random sports fan. They're able to name more people that were in that Final Four 5 years ago than they are able to name like writers at ESPN right now.
Well,
So
that's
does that mean
definitely
ESPN? Yeah.
true. Yeah.
So to me, that's like the height of absurdity there, where I think part of the thing that is really odd about the pay for play and amateurism is apparently Darren Ravel and other ESPN analysts are professionals writing about it. That's fine, but the people aren't professional, and that's.
Oh, Dre's delayed. Let's see if we can get him back here.
Okay.
But maybe you heard enough of what he was saying to
For a
pick up
second,
on that
hopefully
point.
we're saying something brilliant.
Oh, here we go. We got Dre back now.
Yeah, hopefully you said something brilliant while I was frozen up, and my face didn't look too stupid while it was frozen.
It's only for a few seconds, so finish that thought again.
Yeah.
I think I was just mentioning the weird disconnect between ESPN having professionals that write about this, but then the people who are doing the actual event are amateurs, and that weird disconnect and how vehemently they fight for it.
So, I mean, on this score, the O'Bannon case, the case involving the question of whether college players should be able to get money for their names, images, and likenesses. A federal judge last year ruled that, in effect, they should, and that the NCAA is essentially an illegal trust, again, pending appeal. There was an economist brief that was submitted among the materials for the appeal of the O'Bannon case. And one of the things the economist said was, the problem with the NCAA's use of the term amateur is that the term just means whatever they want it to mean, no matter how much it changes over time. So it used to be that you couldn't give players scholarships because that violated the notion of amateurism that used to exist. And then they decided, okay, well, we can give them scholarships. And in fact, for a while, they used to get laundry money. And then they decided they couldn't get laundry money because that violated amateurism. And then this year, in the face of all of this legal pressure, they decided that they would fly the families of the players in the National Football Championship game out to watch them play, which as of 6 months ago would have been an impermissible benefit. So the NCAA,
one of those weird things there that people miss, right, is Bo Jackson. The reason for I think probably long term it was a better narrative, but the reason Bo Jackson ended up doing the baseball football thing was because I believe it was Tennessee. I may be getting the team wrong.
He was at Auburn.
No, I'm saying I think the Tennessee Titans, the football team wanted to bring him out to the thing, and they lied to him and said he was allowed to come out. And it turned out, according to some NCAA rules, he was only allowed to make so many visits, and he exceeded the number of visits he was allowed to make. And because of that, he got in trouble with the NCAA. And because of that, he was so mad at the team for messing up his eligibility with the NCAA. He said he was never going to play for him. So that's why that happened. But to your point, it was the NCAA having this. I don't understand when I talk to people, just from my perspective as a tech guy. As I've told this story, I think it may have been on the podcast with you last time you were on. I had a friend who was flown out by Microsoft to Seattle. They paid for his room. He went and interviewed. They paid for all of his meals while he was out there. Didn't get the job, so he's doing fine though. But according to the NCAA, that may breach something. That kind of stuff is not allowed, and that's, to me, the fact that no one has a problem with this. Especially in the face of the fact they don't get paid. Like, if they were paid, that makes sense, right? If I was getting paid $100,000 a year, and my company said, if Microsoft tries to fly you out there, you're in breach of contract. You're clearly breaking a non-compete clause by letting them pay for you. You do that, we're allowed to fire you or take you to court. Fine. But if I was like, if Dave Barry, when I was like blogging over the Wages of Wins, was like, what are you talking about? Google flew you out and wanted to interview you, and I'd be like, yeah. You'd be like, well, that's not okay. That's essentially what the NCAA is doing.
Well, if I can jump in, Dre, sorry, for one moment, just to clarify the point about Bo Jackson from earlier, I'm showing his Wikipedia page right now, and what it says here is basically He was ruled ineligible by the NCAA following a visit to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
Tampa Bay.
So what he believes is that Tampa Bay called the NCAA and asked them to sabotage his baseball career so they would play football for them.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, just to follow up on this, the arbitrary nature of the NCAA, how the NCAA determines amateurism, how it changes over time. There's no other category of adults who are subjected to these kinds of rules and this kind of treatment really anywhere in the United States. And it's, you know, when the NCAA says that their classic line is that we need to protect the athletes from commercialism. Has anybody here watched an NCAA tournament game? I mean, it's an orgy of commercialism. But in this sort of perverse world of the NCAA, when they say protecting from commercialism, the enterprise can be commercial and make billions of dollars. It's just that the participants can't benefit from that because that would somehow be tainting them. And so it's logic that only works if you're so steeped in it that you just can't imagine any other way of conceiving of this reality.
Yeah, and what you sent along to me is you sent along, it was a second part because there was an article that came out in the HuffPost that said colleges can afford to pay their athletes, and Dave Barry's name popped up there. And they said, yeah, Dave Barry agrees, and Dave Barry, I think, as we've mentioned, like as an economist, whenever you talk about this, he was part of that Northwestern case where he laughed about this. He said they asked him, "Are these athletes exploited in your opinion?" And he went, "Well, in economics, we have a term for what exploitation means. They fit the exact definition of it, so yes." And he told me the rule apparently in court cases, you never ask a question you don't already know what the client is going to answer. So if you're going to ask a question, you know how they're going to answer. He said he can't believe they asked him that question. I'm still amazed. The one shame about that Dave being part of that case is obviously you haven't seen him write about it. So he said, basically the way it kind of works with you academics is you kind of take turns. So if one of you goes to a court case or the lead economic expert, you don't write about it, other people write about it.
Yeah.
So that's a shame there. But you brought this article up with Andrew Zimbalist. I think I have his name right. I mispronounce names all the time, so apologies. That basically tries to kind of refute some of what Dave said. You forwarded this along to me. And I think you mentioned it there, the steeped in the internal logic. Because, like I said, you just said there's no other class of adult people that are treated this way. There's no other job that would have you sign such a restrictive contract that the NCAA has athletes, right? People don't realize about transfer rules, and that you've written about this before. I'll have to start looking up some links. Written time. I'm really impressed by your output level that you regularly do, especially having a job. But basically, a coach can come to your home. A coach can say, "You're going to be the starter for this team. We are a contending team. We're going to be going to the, barring some crazy thing, we're going to the Final Four this year. You're going to lead it. This is going to be your ticket to the NBA. You get to the school. The coach doesn't like you. He benches you. The star player, right? Maybe Derrick Rose on the team was going to come back, but he goes for the NBA. So this team's not as good. You're not going anywhere. You're not getting any minutes, so you're not even getting paid. And you go, screw this. I have 3 other schools that wanted me. I want to go to those schools." Unless the school signs off on you leaving, you can't leave. And you sign this contract that says you can't get paid. And it also says you only get 1 year of that college. You only get 1 year of that scholarship. You're not guaranteed for life. So your future could potentially be screwed. But we have people like Andrew who are basically saying, if we suddenly just made it okay to offer that their money if they wanted to, the entire sports class, that's I think because these schools have already committed money to coaches. I wrote an article that said, some of the top coaches basically have over 100 years of scholarships per year guaranteed to them for 5 years. And they've got things that they've got down. So they're basically saying, if we pay these athletes all of this money that we've already set aside, we couldn't afford to do both, and the entire system would collapse.
Yeah, and I mean, Andre, you made this point before, you know, in our pre-show exchange that every time one of these objections comes up, it's basically saying if athletes are paid, somebody will be inconvenienced. And as you said, every rule inconveniences somebody. Restaurant rules that require employees to wash their hands and maintain certain health standards, they put somebody out. They impose some costs that would not otherwise exist. Those are not in and of themselves arguments for why the rule should not exist. And when it comes,
That is my new favorite. Like we bounced this restaurant metaphor back and forth in email a few times.
yeah,
The employees must wash hands comparison, I think, is my new favorite point. Like
it's
it's
good.
like that may very well up the cost that restaurants have to pay for running water and for hand sanitizer, and maybe you lost productivity because the employee has to spend a few extra minutes washing their hands. It doesn't mean there's not a good reason for that rule.
Yeah, and you know, on thinking about, because if college athletes, and particularly college football and men's college basketball players, but at some schools it could be other athletes. It could be women's basketball players at UConn or Tennessee, for example, and there are other examples. If athletes start to be paid, there will be consequences. There will be a need to think about resources and how to divide up a pie. And, you know, it's not that such a move is consequence free. It's just that, again, that is not the fact that there are consequences to new rules doesn't mean the rules aren't valid. So one of the more, I think, significant concerns that people bring up is if you start to pay athletes in certain sports, are you running the risk that you're going to have to reduce the number of varsity athletes in other sports? Okay, that's an issue that gets brought up.
And they bring up Title IX, of course, because you can't give like preferential treatment.
Right. So Title IX too, which we can come back to. But just thinking about varsity sports for a minute, let's assume that Title IX means you cannot reduce the number of educational opportunities you give to women, which is what Title IX is about. Okay. So let's say that you need to reduce scholarships overall if you're going to start paying players because you don't have the same money available. So you could reduce women's and men's scholarships by an equal amount. So UNC, for example, has 28 varsity sports right now. So if we start paying players, let's say that means we can only fund, I don't know, 22 varsity sports. So we get rid of 3 sports for men and 3 sports for women. We make sure that our gender balance is roughly what it is. Even there, my response is increasingly, okay, so if the golf team, I'm not picking on golf, I'm just using it as an example. If the golf team were a club team instead of a varsity team, it would still accomplish all of the purposes that people who are pro-college athletics ascribe to it. There would still be hard work, discipline, teammates, camaraderie, all the physical exercise, all the things that people say make sports great, you can still get out of club sports. You don't have to have the golf team fly to Hawaii over winter break for it to be a legitimate educational enterprise. So my point is just that even when the trade-offs are real, they're not necessarily the end of the world.
Also, one thing that's really interesting to me that I may have to write this post at some point. And by the way, if you ever want to, because I find my number of ideas for posts greatly exceeds the amount of time I have to write those posts.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to me is people bring up this, well, if we had to pay athletes, we wouldn't be able to afford these coaches or these new facilities. What we notice with rules in place, right? We have all these NCAA rules in place that say you're not allowed to pay the athletes. And as I mentioned, all of these states that, to me, it's kind of foreign to me because, you know, the states I'm in have been in, actually, I guess it is different. I'm in Wisconsin now. And oh my goodness, it's, you know, on Saturday, everybody's wearing Badgers gear. On Sunday, everybody's wearing Packers gear. It's
Yeah.
It's absurd. But we have all of these rich people that are totally willing to pay money under the table, and they set up these intricate black markets essentially to find ways to pay for the athletes. They're basically saying, it's kind of, I guess the comparison I give it is kind of like the New York Knicks. The New York Knicks are a team that says, we have the money for stars. We want a star. And their issue has actually turned into there aren't any stars that want to go there. So that's why Amari Stoudemire, Carmelo Anthony get these big contracts, because they go, we'd really like LeBron James to play. We have the money for LeBron James. We'll do whatever it takes. And LeBron James says, no. College athletics, though, it's the other way around. I guess UNC, right? They're like, we will find a way. We'll get the paper classes, whatever, to get the athletes here. No one brings up the implication that if you were to suddenly start paying athletes and have these rich schools, because, something Dave Barry's written a lot about, the rich stay rich in college athletics, the idea of parity in college sports is a joke. Was it you or someone else that recently either tweeted out or put an article? I think it was in your Monday notes. The Final Four have 27 combined, is it titles or Final Four appearances between them?
Final Four is just the coaches. Yeah.
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 But obviously, the players, I'd be sure. But the rich, that's that right there. The Final Four coaches have 27 combined Final Four appearances between them.
Yeah, Dre, so just on this point for a moment about competitive balance, how could Kentucky possibly recruit more elite basketball players every year than they do right now? Right? I mean, that class with the Harrison twins and Julius Randle last year, didn't they recruit like 6 of the top, 15 high school players in the country? So the idea that pay would somehow reduce competitive balance, as if what we have now even remotely approximates competitive balance, is crazy. In fact, there's a good argument that pay would draw more good players from a school like Kentucky to some other schools, right? Because some other school would find it worthwhile to pay one of their players, I don't know what the number is, $100,000, and they would say, you know what, that's worth it over the scholarship that Kentucky's going to offer me, so I'm going to go there instead. So the competitive balance argument, I don't think works against paying players at all. I think if anything, it works for it.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, what I'm saying is, it gets to a funny point. Like I said, the rich stay rich. If you suddenly told these rich schools, hey, by the way, you have to pay the athletes too, with the system in place, we have people opening their wallets and saying, take my money if it means I have a winning basketball team.
Yes.
That's in place when it's not illegal, right? It's the NCAA. Some distinction people miss, right? The NCAA rules, that's the same as if your company says you're not allowed to surf the net on company time. It's not illegal. You're not going to get arrested for it, but you can't get fired for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So why do we believe that suddenly it was legal? They've already got their wallets open. They're already throwing money at athletes. If we suddenly said you have to pay them if you want to play, we already have a system in place. I think, honestly, and maybe I'm mistaken, maybe we'll get lots of people in the comments shouting me down as how wrong. I think if you suddenly made it mandatory to pay athletes, that basically what it would mean is Kentucky and Duke and whatever would have a one-day drive that would get it. They would say, we want these 5 players, according to the rules, we have to pay them $500,000. That's their market value. We'd really like to win a title. And the boosters would go, $500,000 for a title? Are you kidding me? Here you go. Take the check. It's legal now.
Right. So Andy Schwartz, the economist, who writes really great stuff about paying players and is just a very effective debunker of the current model. He uses this term from economics in his writing called revealed preferences, right? The markets are already trying to speak. And one element of that is what you've brought up, Dre. If there were not a market for these players, if they didn't have value, there wouldn't be all of these under-the-table payments going on all over the place already. One of my favorite examples is Lance Thomas, who I know is playing for the Knicks now, was a starting forward on Duke's 2010 national championship team. He walked into a jewelry store in New York City sometime in late 2009 and put down something like $30,000 on a $95,000 piece of jewelry. And this only came to light because a couple of years later, the jewelry store owner sued him because he never paid up the rest of what he owed. So this question was raised: how did Lance Thomas, a college kid, have $30,000 to fork over in December of 2009. And that, we're not talking about Anthony Davis. We're not talking about John Wall. We're not talking about Blake Griffin. We're not talking about Kevin Love. We're talking about a guy who wasn't even a star in college, who's, I don't know how he got that money, but maybe his family was wealthy. But I think we're seeing players who are not even stars, who clearly somebody really wants them at that university. And that's the market speaking already, even with this totally perverse system that's currently in place.
Oh, we may have lost Dre again. He's looking frozen.
He is looking frozen.
I don't know if we talked about it on the beginning of the show, but he's coming from a hotel room. And
next week I'll be back in.
So yeah, that artwork behind you, Dre, that's not from your personal collection?
No, I'm in a motel in San Jose, which is about 15 minutes away from the airport. I actually did a swap today to be closer, so I could drive to the airport as need be. So sorry, the Lance Thomas, I just heard the end of that. So was there anything you said right after the end of that?
No, that was it.
The market, I think that there is a huge aspect to what you just said there, and I'm going to definitely put that in the post. It's great. But yeah, the market's already talking, and that to me is what's so absurd. It's so absurd to have, the side-by-sides, right? Can you believe I forget the contract amounts, right? But the contract amount for the Final Four March Madness is X billion next to schools are losing money, and people not viewing the disconnect and going, wait a minute, we're simultaneously hearing something is fantastic and something is horrible, and there is something a little off here. Like, one of those has to be wrong, and I find people just choose the story that's more convenient at the time, right?
Yeah.
So we talked for a bit, and I feel a little remiss, especially since you brought up, you actually like, or actually rather, you don't like writing as much about politics, but it comes up in sports. But just, I don't want to open up a can of worms, but obviously the racial aspect of it seems like that's a huge part. I'm in Colorado. I think 2 years ago, they got a rookie who I think was the #1 pick in the draft, and I believe he was a 19. I think he was an 18-year-old. Forget his name. I apologize. I don't follow hockey that much, but he was amazing. He goes to the playoffs. We got into the playoffs.
Yeah.
We're going to make it there this year, but last year we made it to the playoffs. He had like 3 goals in 5 games or something. Everybody was on board. He's a young player known as a problem. People like the NHL was opening their wallets to give this kid money to play professionally young, and then in professional basketball and football we have the opposite. I obviously don't have time to go over that, and I'll welcome you back on the show if you want to talk more or as much as you want, but it seems like that's a huge part of this component. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, 2 points. No, I mean, I certainly agree. I've written a lot about age limits and their racial dynamics. I was actually very happy to see that one of the lawyers for the NBA Players Association recently said, when we reopen the collective bargaining agreement, we are not going to accept, Adam Silver wants to extend the age minimum to 20 years from the current 19 years. And the NBA Players Association lawyer said, we are not going to accept that. And actually said this is clearly racial, that in sports like hockey, there's no problem with 18-year-olds playing in the NHL. So why should there be in the NBA? And so there's no question that that's an issue. And there's one other racial issue, which again, maybe is, worth setting aside to talk in more depth at another time. But, every big time college sports university now is a predominantly white university. And those predominantly white universities are recruiting significant numbers of black athletes, often from disadvantaged black backgrounds, to come to campus to help them win and to provide the money to fund all of these other sports that don't really make money for the school and are predominantly white kids and often middle to upper middle class kids. So there's a real racial perversity, I'm sorry to use that word again, to just the whole system of college athletics from that standpoint. I mean, the number of African American males who are accepted at UNC every year is something like 100. And a third or more of those are athletes. So, and UCLA has very similar numbers. So this is another really kind of unseemly part of college athletics that people don't really want to talk about, that black labor is funding. I'm being a little bit provocative here, but black labor is funding white privilege. And it's among the things that I know the folks who founded CARE FC are very troubled by.
So, question, I want to make sure this is on the air. That, you said it was provocative, but I love that line. If I use that line just as is in the show notes, do you have any complaints about that?
What, say that again?
I'm saying, as you know, I write show notes up after the end of each show, and that on its own, just as a soundbite. But as we mentioned before the show, a lot of people, many more people listen to the show than watch the show. Watch the show if you're listening. Brian does a lot of good graphics. You get to see my lovely face get frozen in front of bad hotel art. So, watch the show, but many more people listen than watch, and many more people read than listen. So when I put sound bites or whatever, but that line was just perfect. And I think I really want to put that in the post when it's written up. But wanted to make sure I asked you first, and before I even forgot to ask post-show.
Yeah, that's fine. That's
perfect. That is, I mean, that right there is awesome. I'm trying to think of anything else I can say. I mean, we can go much longer. I think that there's a nice topic to wrap up on, which you're just full of amazing sound bites. So you called it the perils of a guilty conscience. And I think we're talking about this, right? Because we're talking, you said, I believe you said when we started the show, that UNC is the first school, like, sports club that you've gotten behind as an adult.
Yeah.
So it's clearly part of you clearly root. This weekend, I met up with Chris Ye and Brian, and we met at a bar, and the Final Four was on. And I sat down and I basically confessed that, no matter how much all of us might talk about the wrongness of college athletics, that if I sat down and the Badgers game was on and there was 5 minutes to go, I would get mad if the bartender tried to turn it off. I wouldn't come in and incredulously say, turn off that ridiculous thing. I would say, don't you dare touch that dial. And in fact, that happened with me and Brian. We were watching a basketball game earlier, and it was 2 minutes left to go. Brian was like, going to go. And I was like, the game's on. It's 2 minutes left. There's 5 points. There's Final Four. I think it was Sweet 16 at that point. So this reconciling, understanding the pernicious aspects, I'm stealing this from Anita Sarkeesian on Feminist Frequency, that's the line she uses, but the pernicious aspects of it while still enjoying it and kind of putting those together. And sorry, I'm stealing the mic, but then one other thing, as I mentioned, Brian and I saw WrestleMania this weekend. Yeah. And the day before, I had gotten a free ticket to meet Dean Ambrose, who was competing in a ladder match. And obviously, ladder matches are among the most dangerous matches you can have in WrestleMania, because basically you accept that you're going to go up, you're going to climb up on a ladder and fall over 3 or 4 times at minimum. And this guy, in fact, basically got body slammed through a ladder in the match. And I believe he was actually injured, because you could actually see paramedics at the sideline. He didn't come back from the match. And I saw him the day before, and he was limping around. And, this reconciliation of the next day I was going to be on the sidelines, I was going to be cheering, I was going to be enjoying it. But the fact that there is a human being there that's going to be putting their body at risk, and even in his case, he's actually getting paid relatively good money. But even so, I know for a fact that WWE doesn't offer health insurance. So reconciling the mistreatment of human life with enjoying the activity and how to go for that, I actually I don't have a good answer, because I've been thinking about that all weekend. What are your thoughts on that? Because you read a blog where you basically shout down this thing that you just mentioned you clearly love.
I know. Right. So I guess the first thing I have to say is I'm a hypocrite, because, and I'm a huge football fan. And, needless to say, the more we're finding out about football, the harder it is to cheer on that sport in good conscience, given what it's doing to its participants. So I wish I had a better answer. I will say that this isn't like a principled stand or anything like that. I will say that when I watch college sports now, and partly it's just because I've gotten older, but when I watch college sports now, I do not have the same level of enthusiasm for it I did even 10 years ago. And it's because there's just too much about it that's problematic for me to just wholeheartedly and unabashedly root for whatever I'm watching. But even that, Dre, that's kind of a bummer for me. This is one of the great things about sports is that you forget about everything else and you're just in the moment, and that's the only thing you care about. And the fact that I can't quite experience a lot of my sports rooting in the same way anymore, it's a bummer in a way. It's not something I enjoy. It's not something I'm proud of. It just kind of blows, actually.
And it was one of the things, Patrick, I really wish you could have been on the show. We'll have to get Patrick to interview, make sure it's tit for tat there. But Patrick brought up that at the beginning of this year, he decided, you know what, I can't root for football. Football is wrong. Patrick, for backstory, as you know, lives in Seattle. And one of the things he mentioned, he's like, well, you can only go so long as a resident of Seattle saying, I'm not going to watch football, before you basically just admit you're going to cut off your friends. Because about week 8 in, every weekend his friends are going, want to come over and watch the game this weekend? Want to go to the bar and watch the game? Want to go to our Super Bowl party? And it's like, there's something I'll say about sports that I've gotten a much bigger appreciation as I started blogging about it. It is one of those things, and we talked this at the very beginning of the show, it brings people together. It brings people together that would not otherwise get together. Even us, we're both academics, but we're, as we mentioned at the beginning of the show, I had thought I had met you at an economics concert. I feel so an economics conference. And what I realized basically is like it was 1 degree separated. I knew Dave, Dave knew you. You didn't actually even know each other, but you just like it had to have been sports, right? Dave and you got to know each other because of sports.
Yes.
Sports has opened up a big community of people that are now integral in my life, and we get together to talk about sports. We have other stuff we talk about, and I think there is a lot of value there. And then just one of the collateral things we have to not have to accept, but realize when you love sports is this thing that makes your life very possible. This communal life has a lot of problems with it, and that's all I got there.
Look, I'm with you. I mean, sports has been a central passion in my life since I was 7 years old. And it would be nice if it were not quite as sullied as it feels like it is these days.
It gets weird to me because, especially in business, we talked about, I've kind of just learn to accept that, people are greedy and you can get mad at them for it, but at the same time, it's like the same people that are going to yell about Carmelo Anthony in New York. I feel so bad that you have to be a Knicks fan.
Yes, it's a tragic
fan, by the way. I'm curious about this. So as you grow up in New York, you said you went to Michigan, you're at North Carolina. Why are you a Knicks fan again?
So I grew up 4 blocks from Madison Square Garden.
Oh, wow. And did you get a chance to go to Stephens?
Yeah, I'm a lifelong Knicks fan, and my fate is such that the first year I started rooting for the Knicks was 1973, 1974. So,
was that the year they won the title? Because they won a few there,
72,
right?
73 is their last title.
Really?
I was 7 at the time. I started rooting for them a few months later, and this is what I've been stuck with ever since.
So for the superstitious Knicks fans watching us, it's your fault. Because as soon as you hopped on the bandwagon.
You can definitely blame me for, yeah.
Although the reality of that, the Knicks, by the way, and this is this is one of those few cases where it lines up perfectly. The last year the Knicks made the finals was in '99, and that was right when Dolan took over. Because the Knicks did make it. They made it to 1 in the '90s. They made it to 1. They made it to 2 in the '90s, right? They went with 1 with Patrick Ewing when Jordan was out.
They made it in '94 and '99. Yeah.
Yeah. As soon as Dolan took over, is when it's not surprising. This is one of those cause and effect things that isn't hard to crack.
Yes, it's the Dolan. The name itself kills me just thinking about that guy. But yeah.
Yeah, it's one thing I'll say, because we brought up wrestling. I do like having characters in professional sports. And Mark Cuban and James Dolan are definitely characters, but still, you want a winning team in New York, and
You do.
the Nets and the Knicks aren't doing it.
Look, the ultimate character owner, I'm a lifelong Yankees fan too, was George Steinbrenner. And, we hated George Steinbrenner for a long time, but he kind of figured out how to be a good owner his last 15 years or so. So maybe somehow,
you
that'll
figure
happen to James Dolan.
what we need to have happen then, right, is Steinbrenner got like parodied on Seinfeld, so we just need James Dolan to get parodied on a popular sitcom, and that'll be it.
Well, first we need him to be suspended from the NBA for 2 years. Then we need him to be parodied on Seinfeld, and then we're all set.
Perfect. Or I guess pains me, but Dave's a fan of the show. He had The Big Bang Theory. I'm not a huge fan. What you mentioned, I'll wrap this kind of up here on the perils of a guilty conscience. I've run into the same thing recently with basically pop culture, because I also write a lot about representation in pop culture. We talked a little bit of Silicon Valley before the show. One of the things that made me love Silicon Valley is they actually had not a Hispanic character regular, but they had an Indian main character, which for the tech field, you really wish there were more. The one on The Big Bang Theory is a caricature. I really liked having Kumail Nanjiani. He's an amazing stand-up comedian. I liked having a realistic minority character on a show, one that wasn't just a token parody of what you expect a minority to act like. But, representation in pop culture is just one of those things where now I can't enjoy a lot of things that I watch, because I recognize, I'm like, oh, this is the trope you're using that's, basically misogynistic or racist. And that slowly, it doesn't stop you from enjoying pop culture, but it slowly takes away from it. And I think the last kind of exclamation point to put on this, and I think we as people know, is we can talk about it, but we're limited. Like, if you stopped watching UNC, if you even put a big sign on your door as a professor at UNC that said, I will not watch UNC sports, I am opposed to it for, political and, moral reasons, and all of you should not watch it, it would not make a dent.
Correct. It would mean absolutely nothing. Yes.
And I think, as kind of a last note, I think the Freakonomics guys talk about this, like the idea of boycotting Summer and Winter Olympics, back when the USSR and us were feuding, they basically point out it's a nice kind of like show to like basically act, to make your point known, but it does nothing politically. It doesn't change policy. It doesn't change people's mind. It basically just tells the world, here's what I think. And you can do that. There's not a problem with it, but to be fair, what people can do is stuff like you're doing. You joined a coalition. You can do stuff like Dave Barry does, where, he testifies in court as an expert witness, puts his name on stuff. People that do stuff like that I have a lot of respect for. And, while I would like to shout at people that keep rooting, I understand that it's like you not rooting isn't going to solve the problem unless you get another 10,000 people to follow you. And that's really hard to do.
Right.
Yep, and I think obviously it's not that we're winding down; it's that we could go for another hour if we started back up. So we've hit over an hour. I'm going to try and cheat. This is what you do: you ask the person on air so that they have to commit to it. I hope we're going to have you back on the show at some point in the future.
Anytime, I'd love to come back whenever it works for you all. So
and whenever if you give, you're one of the people. There are other people out there, so I'm not making this unique to you. So those of you listening, don't get offended. But with as much as we bring up you and Kevin Draper, if you give Brian, our producer, and myself enough advance notice, we will find a way to get you on the show.
Awesome.
It would have to be something crazy. We'd have to have like Adam Silver as the guest, and we'd be like, "We got Adam Silver. Can you go a week later?" But
I would step aside for Adam Silver. So yeah.
But if you give us advance warning, you're welcome to be on the show. Just so you're aware, the way we end the show is typically with shout outs. I realize I didn't give you any coaching about that pre-show. But if you have anybody on the internet, blogger or athlete or whatever, that you just like to say, hey, you're cool this week, that's how we typically end it. As you know, you're usually one of those people. And Brian, you're allowed to shout out Jonathan Weiler at the end of the show, but I'm just gonna say it's like that's a softball. So warning you about that as your shout out, Brian.
All right, well, I'll start with a shout out. So I mentioned him a little bit earlier, but Andy Schwarz, sounds like Schwartz, but without the T, who's an economist and writes really great stuff about the NCAA and the collegiate model. And as I said, is a particularly effective debunker. And actually today at Vice Sports, he's got a really nice piece about why the arguments against paying college players don't really stand up to scrutiny. So that's a guy to shout out.
I'm excited about that one. I've got two, and this one of these, Brian, you can mock me. I just told you that I thought it was cheap to do this, but I kind of have to. So the first is Dean Ambrose, as I mentioned. He's a professional wrestler. Got to meet him, nice guy. I've listened to some interviews. It's both enjoyable and tragic to listen to. So I actually listened to an interview about him. I mentioned he was in a ladder match. And he had this interview where he was just like, well, the ladder match, you just know you're going to get injured. A bunch of stuff can go wrong. And it's tragic to listen to this behind the scenes, to listen to someone basically know that they're putting their body in a tremendous amount of harm's way and just be okay with it. And then know that you get enjoyment from it. But that said, was a nice guy. Going to give a shout out to that.
And he did get hurt in the match also, by the way. It did come true.
Yeah, we mentioned that, and that made it even rougher. And then the other two, we spent this, an hour talking about paying athletes. And while Dave Barry did have some stuff out this week, some good articles, they weren't as much about this. He says he was on a few radio interviews, so if we get links for those. But Marina, I hope I'm getting her name right. It's either Adshade or Adshade. I hope I'm getting it wrong. I probably should have asked Dave or her before this. And Dave Barry, they had two fantastic posts about the NFL, which, we had you on the show, Jonathan, and we didn't talk the NFL. We could easily go for like 5 hours just talking all of your posts and all the stuff you write about regularly. But basically they had two funny posts. The first was that cheerleaders in the NFL are underpaid, that they should pay them better. And then they followed it up, Dave Barry followed it up with an article in The Atlantic that said that, hey, guess what? The demand for for NFL players is probably overrated. And players like, how am I dropping his name? Quarterback of the Green Bay Packers. I'm going to kick that out of the state. Aaron Rodgers. That Aaron Rodgers is probably overpaid. So he basically said in the same week, football players are overpaid. Football cheerleaders are underpaid. Love it. Definitely deserve a shout out for that. Brian, you just listed two. Do you want to list your shout outs?
Yeah, first off, the 30 for 30 show you were referencing earlier was called The Pony XS, about Southern Methodist University, SMU. Of course, their backfield was the Pony Express, so they had a little clever play on words there in the documentary. But basically, they got what was called the death penalty by the NCAA, meaning they can't play at all, like you said. And what led to that was basically their boosters just stopped respecting the NCAA's rule. They kept paying players brazenly over and over again, and that finally led to the death penalty coming down. One of my favorite episodes of that show, really interesting, a lot of great characters in it.
Brian, just to second you, that's a fantastic 30 for 30, the one about SMU.
The reason why it's so good is it's very small in scope, I want to say. It's really about the people involved more than anything, and that's what makes it so good to me.
Yeah.
And then secondly, I guess I've got one more since we're getting all social justice-y here. I've got Rick Welts, one of the few gay executives in pro sports with our Golden State Warriors here locally. He has thanked the NCAA and NBA and Indiana Pacers for speaking out against Indiana's Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And we'll see if, words on Twitter are all that happens, or if, they actually do anything about the Final Four coming up in Indiana. Probably not, but anyway, thanks Rick Welts for saying that.
And we didn't talk that either. There was a lot going on this week because I can't believe we didn't talk.
So many things.
All right. Next time.
All right. Well, that's excellent. So you can find the show at boxscoregeeks.com if you somehow found the show without, just listening and haven't visited the site. You can find us on iTunes and Stitcher at the Boxscore Geeks Show. Make sure to subscribe and vote us up if you haven't. You can find the live video shows, which more of you should watch, on Channel Nerd Numbers. We have a playlist for the Boxscore Geeks Show, updates weekly. You can find Jonathan Weiler on Twitter at John Weiler, and then at the ESPN Watch. If that's not on your RSS feed, put it there. Spend all night reading like the last couple months. It's great stuff. It's a must-read for any sports fan. And yeah, with that, hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll see you next week.